good evening. Thank you for coming. My name is Eric Cohen. I'm the chapter leader of the Chicago chapter of America's Future Foundation. We're an organization dedicated to developing the next generation of classical liberal leaders here in Chicago. Really thankful for everybody for coming out tonight and our friends from CAN TV for being here as well. I'll give a quick introduction to our speakers and then we'll let them get to it. So Ed Bachrach and Austin Berg have a new book out called The New Chicago Way. As you probably know, we're in the midst of a election season here in Chicago, and Chicago has been so traditionally dominated by the Chicago way, probably best summed up by Milton Rakoff if you've ever read the books. Don't make no waves, don't back no losers, and we don't want nobody, nobody sent, which is not only a perfect summation of Chicago, but also of Chicago grammar. So Austin and Ed have a really fascinating new book out about what Chicago can learn from the way other big cities operate. It will probably not surprise you to learn that Chicago is dramatically different from a lot of other big cities. So without any further ado, I want to introduce Ed Bachrach, is the retired CEO of Bachrach Clothing, which I went to college in Decatur and shopped there all the time, and I loved it. And the founder and president of the Center for Pension Integrity in Chicago. His op-eds have been published in the Wall Street Journal, Chicago Tribune, and Chicago Sun-Times. And Austin Berg is an award-winning writer, is the director of content strategy at the Illinois Policy Institute. He contributes opinion columns to the Illinois News Network and wrote the documentary film Madigan, Power, Privilege, Politics. Ed and Austin, take it away.
Thanks, Eric. Give it up for Eric Cohen and his new glasses. Wow. So we're going to use it. This microphone's not connected to anything, but it's for our public television, sponsors. They're not sponsors. Our guests, fans, stands. Thank you for being here. We don't address public television in the book, even though that's a city-run function. Happy Fat Tuesday. Thank you, everyone, very, very much for coming. We're just going to go through quickly sort of where Chicago stands among major big cities, what our problems are, and some solutions gleaned from our research. So I'll start with the basic hypothesis of the book. Chicago is an outlier by almost any measure. You can take crime, you can take finances, you can take education outcomes. On many different measures, we're an outlier. And our thesis for the book is that we're an outlier because our governance structure is an outlier. And specifically, we are the only remaining major strongman government, the only major city that has a strongman government in the United States, and the strongman is the mayor. So Ed can talk a bit about the methodology, I guess, of how we went about researching that.
So a little bit about the book, as Austin said, we find that the problems in Chicago are rooted in the mayor-centric form of government. How do we know that? We took as our representative sample the top 15 cities of the United States by population. And we compared Chicago's outcomes to those other cities. And you'll see this as we go through some of the data tonight. It shows that we're an outlier. And then we looked at their governance structure. And you'll see that represented. The next step is that we talk to scores of people in all of these cities. Public officials, we talk to city councilmen, we talk to aides to mayors, we talk to academics, we talk to civic leaders, and we talk to people that are in the opposition. And we asked them, they said, now your city runs a little different than ours. How's that working out for you? And so they told us what they thought the pros and cons were of their governance structure. And that's what informed the suggestions that we have in the book. One more comment before we talk about how we came to write the book. The book is not a lament. We do talk about the problems, but there are a lot of books about Chicago that just P&M and talk about all the problems in the city, and they don't have any practical and actionable solutions. This book does. The book is not an ad hominem screed. It is not a criticism of the actions, character, or personality of any particular leader. As a matter of fact, it's our position that in the current governance structure, you could elect Mother Teresa or Pericles as the mayor, and they would make the same mistakes. And finally, The book is not an ideological polemic. There is nothing ideological or partisan about the suggestions. The suggestions that we have, and we have 4 pages of suggestions in the back of the book, are all things that other cities, many of them large, urban, democratic, union-dominated cities, have done to solve their problems. So that's a little bit about the book. Let's talk about how we came to write the book. I'll talk about myself first, and then Austin will tell you how he came to it. I am a retired businessman. When I was an undergraduate back just after the earth cooled, I took a class called the Corporation and Public Policy, and I got the bug for studying and learning about public policy. I operated a family business most of my life, but in 2005 I sold the business, and the very next year I hightailed it to grad school and got a degree in public policy. I returned to Chicago in 2007, and I started seeing decisions made 2008, 2009, 2010, as well as some that before I left that just took my breath away. And I said, how did these things happen in this city? And then I started to look around at other cities. I focused first, and for about 4 years, I worked on the problem of the underfunded pensions in the city of Chicago, and we have a whole chapter about that in the book. But then I came to realize that the problem is bigger and more deep-seated. It's in the governance structure of the city. And so I started looking around for somebody to be a co-author of the book, and I'll let Austin tell you about that.
And then I showed up. So I worked for the Illinois Policy Institute. Some of you in the room may be familiar with that group. No? Okay. Oh, round of applause for Thea Baldwin, by the way, who designed this beautiful cover. She's right there. And these slides that you're about to watch. So at the Illinois Policy Institute, when I came on, we were just starting a fight to legalize food carts in Chicago. So if you've been to Little Village or Pilsen, you'll know that there are women, mostly older Latino women, selling tamales or sliced fruit or hot chocolate. And those were illegal for decades in Chicago, but we told the story of one of the vendors, Claudia Perez, got a lot of grassroots attention behind that issue, and then eventually passed an ordinance in Chicago that allowed those vendors to get licenses and be official businesses in the city of Chicago, instead of operating in an underground economy where they were vulnerable to violence or police abuse and things of that sort. But as soon as that ordinance passed, you saw aldermen stand up and say, not on this street, not on this street, not on this street, not on this street in my ward, not on this sidewalk, not in front of this business. And I thought, that's interesting. I'm not sure if that happens in other big cities. We talked a lot with New York City street vendors, and those types of things never happened. That's odd. So then in 2016, the year after we passed that ordinance, I worked on a documentary on the Speaker of the House, Mike Madigan. And most of that documentary surrounds structural sources of power. It's not about the person, his or herself, it's about the structures they are able to maintain, whether that's chairmanship of a party apparatus and of state government, whether it's serving as a property tax appeals attorney, whether it is the House rules that grant that person more power than anyone else in any state legislature in the country. So those two things together sort of made me really interested when Ed came to me to speak about the structural nature of power in Chicago. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that is so antiquated. So here's our sample size. These are the top 15 cities in the nation by population. We interviewed folks in every single one of these cities across a number of different topics and areas of governance.
Can you read out some numbers for those of us?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, Chicago's up at number 3 with 2.7 million people. Houston is growing and will probably surpass Chicago at some point in the next couple of decades. New York's at the top with 8.4 million, then LA with 3.9 million. And then everywhere below Houston is a city below 1.5 million people. So Philly, Phoenix, San Antonio, San Diego, Dallas, San Jose, Austin, Jacksonville, San Francisco, Indianapolis, and Columbus. Those are the 15 largest.
Excuse me, are there
back. For the most part, yeah. Absolutely. The question was, are they mostly Democratic cities? Houston, purple-ish. But yeah, I would say for the most part, largely Democratic cities.
There are,
Yeah.
some that may be known to be Republican, but many of these cities also operate on a nonpartisan basis. But Indianapolis, Jacksonville, Dallas, Houston, and Phoenix, I think, would be considered perhaps sometimes Republican.
And we're going to do questions at the end too, so any questions you have, feel free. Next slide. So this is the headline you'll see. Most everybody in the city knows this. This is what's nationally reported on, and this is the homicide rate. We're up at almost 25 per 100,000 population, which is more than New York and Los Angeles combined. But we just saw this mayoral race. What is the one solution to all of this? It is always pointed to by every candidate, and it's more cops. We need more cops. Here's the police officers per 10,000 population. We have the most cops per 10,000. It's not a manpower problem when it comes to police officers generally in Chicago.
And almost twice the per capita number of patrolmen that Los Angeles has.
Oh,
Yeah.
You want to talk about the two things LA did? We can talk about that.
Well, we'll get to that.
Okay.
Let's just go through this.
Sounds good.
Call it a lightning round, and if we talk about it, it won't go so fast.
This is really small type, but Chicago's peers in education. One of the few areas where you do see Chicago's leaders look to other cities for governance advice is on the issue of an appointed or an elected school board. You hear a lot of candidates talk about, hey, the mayor shouldn't appoint the school board, that should be an elected body. We are rare in letting the mayor appoint the school board. New York City, these are the 20 largest school districts by enrollment, by the way. So New York City, Chicago, Hawaii, and Philadelphia are the only 4 among the top 20 where the mayor appoints the school board. So what does that,
This last column shows the expenditures per pupil for each school district.
So when you take all of those expenditures and average them out, you'll get appointed school boards on average spend $17,600 per student. Elected school boards spend just under $11,000 per student. So you often hear folks worry about things like union capture when it comes to elected school boards, and that's always the big issue in Chicago. The one thing that's left out, especially in the Chicago discussion, is that Chuy Garcia was almost mayor. That was the CTU candidate. So if the mayor is completely beholden to a public sector union, such as the teachers union, he controls the whole kit and caboodle. He controls the entire school board. So we do, in the book, talk a lot about the merits of appointed or elected school boards, but there are far bigger recommendations that we have for school governance and especially school finances that are more important than that issue, in our view.
So this is the per capita pension debt for Chicago compared to the other major cities. And as you can see, with $43 billion worth of pension debt in the city of Chicago, it's greater than 44 of the 50 states.
So we also think that size matters when it comes to your number of aldermen. Chicago, you'll see, hovers around 55,000 constituents per council member, whereas LA is over 250,000 people. So you saw Bill Daley actually in the mayor's race talk about how we need to cut aldermen from 50 to 15. That's part of the solution, but it doesn't matter unless you change their responsibilities. And the real problem with Chicago having so few constituents per council member is it allows them to be involved in every minute detail of administrative minutia in their ward. They're going to approve the awnings, the public signage, the valet parking, all rezoning. You can't do that when you have 250,000 people as your constituents. Your congressman isn't going to be the person in charge of garbage. There's too many garbage bins to take care of, right? So reducing the number, we recommend reducing the number of aldermen, cutting it in half to 25, But far more important than that is changing their responsibilities to be legislators rather than ombudsmen or administrators.
And we do, the book has a comprehensive set of suggestions just in this one chapter about the mayor and the city council. And you can't just, we wouldn't recommend you just cherry pick. Just reducing the number of aldermen and leaving everything the same accomplishes nothing. So we also recommend symbolically you do away with the whole concept of an alderman and a ward, and you have a city councilman and you have a legislative district, and there are many other reforms that we talk about that are part of a whole package there.
So this slide shows Chicago and San Francisco are the only major cities to allow the mayor to fill city council vacancies. So when we started writing this book, the stat was in the last 28 years, the mayor of Chicago had appointed 28 aldermen. So you can't imagine if that's how the federal system worked. You can't expect the legislative body to serve as an effective check on the executive when the executive is appointing that many members of the legislative body. It's ridiculous. So the dance, yeah. I can talk about it.
So just to emphasize what Austin just said, if you suggest to somebody that whenever there's a vacancy in Congress that it be filled by the President of the United States, I think people would blow a gasket. They want a special election for something like that. But the other thing that we all know that happens in Chicago is an alderman runs for re-election, and then the day after he wins, he walks into the mayor's office and negotiates his resignation. They always do it early on, and they get something in return from the mayor. They don't wait and resign or decide not to run unless the feds suggest that be the case. They don't wait until the end. They always get a political or some other economic favor in exchange for their resignation.
And then finally, in terms of city council sort of being a rubber stamp body, this is a large cause as well. There's no term limits on Chicago aldermen. Philly, Indy, and Columbus are the only 4 cities that don't place any term limits on council members. Chicago also doesn't have a term limit on the mayor, and it's the only major city among the top 10 to not have term limits on the mayor or the council. Philly has term limits on the mayor. So how do we change this? You could have city council pass an ordinance saying, we don't approve street signage anymore, we don't approve these things anymore, we should disempower the mayor in many ways. But at the end of the day, that can be changed on a whim if it's not instantiated in some kind of constitution or foundational document for the city. And Chicago and Indianapolis are the only 2 big cities in America that do not have a city constitution, which is called a city charter. And when people in Chicago hear the word charter, we've been presenting this book all over the place, they think of charter schools. And that's absurd. This is the modern, normal, average way that all big cities in the US are governed is through a charter, and Chicago doesn't have one. And so all the changes we make pretty much throughout the book would be done through a voter-approved city charter, and the state would have to get involved to let Chicagoans actually build that document for themselves. But there's a great guide, the National Civic League, right, has an amazing guide on charters, and the city could easily follow that. You could have Joe Ferguson be the head of the Charter Commission, and assemble that board and then present it to voters, and they would approve their governing document. So we think of anything in this presentation that you take home, it's that Chicago needs a city charter.
So we have a chapter on elections, and Chicago, as we know, had our municipal election last week. A little nippy out, wasn't it? I don't think anybody got any mosquito bites when they went to vote. So we're the only major city that has its municipal elections in February. And you can see some statistics here. The average low temperature in February in Chicago is 21.7 degrees. In November, it's 34.5. Average snowfall, 9 inches versus 1.3 snowfall days, and voter turnout. And voter turnout we showed that the average since the year 2000 was 36%. It was 34.2% last February or last week. So there is substantial literature also that shows that timing affects turnout. And it also shows that when turnout is low, it favors special interests. So that's looking at it charitably. Why do we have our elections in February? Austin?
It's an incumbency protection program. So, and you really, I mean, there's a so if you guys followed the coverage of the municipal elections last Tuesday, there was all these people running around with their hair on fire talking about record low turnout. Chicagoans, it's a historic election. Why can't you see? You need to elect, you need to vote for mayor. It's the first time we've had this open runoff. It's 34% turnout. That's the average turnout in Chicago. It was nothing different. And it's because of seasonality is one huge reason for that. And as you see, most major cities put their elections, municipal elections in November, some of them even in presidential years. But November is when people vote. So cities put elections in November, unlike us. So this is one of the more important things we looked at. We took 3 fiscal firewalls, we call it, which are blocks in government that encourage sound, disciplined budgeting. The first one we looked at was, do you have an independent elected controller? In Chicago, if you guys voted last Tuesday, you know that we have 2 citywide offices other than the mayor. They're called the city clerk. Raise your hand if you know what the city clerk does. Thank you. City treasurer. Anyone know who that does? Yeah. Okay. We got one.
Clerk does the vehicle stickers.
Clerk does stickers. Cool. That's a cool elected office to have, the sticker person. That's really important. We should have a citywide election for the sticker person. So most big cities have a citywide office that's either a controller or sometimes even a city manager that has real independent budgeting power and serves as a check on the executive when it comes to budgeting. They produce their own numbers. They have real input in the budgeting process. Chicago is the biggest city to lack an independent elected controller or city manager.
Question. Wasn't the woman in Dixon an independently elected city controller?
Rita Crundwell, actually, Thea, do you know if Rita Crundwell was elected? She's from Dixon. But
I suspect no, because she was there since she was 18.
yeah. We'll do questions at the end, so hold your questions. But as you can see, New York, Los Angeles, Houston, and Philadelphia all have independent elected controllers, and they all have budgets that are far better than Chicago's. Here's the second measure we looked at, robust city council involvement. Chicago is a rubber stamp. We have no robust city council involvement in budgeting. Most aldermen don't even attend the budget hearings. There's no reason for them to. They're too busy doing whatever they do in their wards. So when you overlay independent elected controller and robust council involvement, Chicago's only one of 3 cities that has neither of those 2 things. San Francisco and Indianapolis also lack them. And then the final one, do voters get approval over new tax hikes and new debt? We don't. So across the board, we're the only city that lacks all 3 of those. So you get lemons.
So just to give you an example of how this works, we did a comparison of Chicago and Los Angeles on the 2 largest categories of expenditure in municipal services, police and fire protection. So Los Angeles has a land area that is more than twice Chicago's. The population is 45% larger than Chicago's, and yet both cities spend about the same dollars for police and fire protection. So if Chicago just had parity with Los Angeles based on population, they would save $650 million a year in those departments, not including the pension multiplier.
And they have real fires in Los Angeles, and their homicide rate is a 5th or 6th of ours. So they're spending the same amount of money to cover more people over more land area and getting better services. This is the only government entity we looked at that wasn't city level was the MPEA, Metropolitan Pier and Exposition Authority, simply because the city's heavily involved in it, and the mayor especially is heavily involved in it, appoints half the board, and it holds $4 billion in debt that all of us are going to have to pay. It also gets around 150 to 160 million dollars a year in things like car rental taxes and a 1% extra sales tax on dining in the Loop and even far north of the Loop. It gets a car rental tax on all car rentals in Cook County to fund McCormick Place and Navy Pier. Essentially, it governs. So that's the total debt number, $4 billion. Here's the 4 largest convention centers in the country. $4 billion on McCormick Place in terms of debt. Orlando's got $600 million. Las Vegas, $850 million. Georgia, $190 million. There's a guy who's a University of Illinois professor. Now he's down in Dallas, named Haywood Sanders. He wrote a book called Convention Center Follies. It's one of the best. If you want to really nerd out about like a public action kind of problem, it is the convention center industry. And politicians and private business interests have a huge interest in funneling more and more debt into these projects in an industry that is dying. And it's never going to be like it was in the 1980s, where you got all the muffler salesmen to Chicago and ingested all this, infused all this money into the local economy. We take an operating loss every year on this, 250 debt service. We take an operating loss every year.
And so finally, now we're getting a little esoteric, but this is a chart from actually a terrific book if you're really a public policy nerd. It was written in 1981 by Sam Huntington, and it's called American Politics, The Promise of Disharmony. So if we think we've got disharmony right now, he was writing about it back then. And what he talked about is the fact that some people, we have our political institutions, and some people have high ideals for their institutions, and some don't. And some people have a perception that their institutions are just what we need, and others say, no, our institutions are woefully lacking. What we contend is that in Chicago, we have the majority of people who are unclear whether there's a difference between how our institutions are serving us and how they should, and the intensity of their beliefs in whether we should have a better government is also low. So they are in the lower right-hand quadrant here, and they are complacent individuals, and they ignore the gap that we have. Other cities that have mobilized and reformed are far different. They have a highly intense belief in the ideals for their government, and they have a perception that there is a gap. And so they are moralistic about it. They are active reform movements, and they reduce the gap, and they eliminate the gap. And that's what we saw in city after city that have reformed.
So we can take questions now. If anyone, Mr. Cohen, can pass you the mic.
I'll do the Phil Donahue routine real quick, but I just want to give the friendly reminder that I always do, that we love all of you, but questions end in question marks. So preferably not the 8 paragraphs, then do you agree with me too? So we'll take questions for a little while here, and I'll run around with the microphone. So.
Thanks, Eric. I enjoyed both of these. 2 questions, 2 quick ones. One is, what explains the difference in crime between Chicago and LA? Number 2 is, why haven't Ken Griffin and the business community led some kind of reform?
I could take the policing question, then Ed could take the Ken Griffin question, I guess. So if you talk to police reformers in LA, you quickly realize that LA policing reputation post-Rodney King was as bad or worse than Chicago policing reputation is now. And that's reflected, most unfortunately, in the murder clearance rate, which hovers around 20%. So if you shoot and kill someone, 1 in 5 odds you're getting caught or charged. And that's largely because of a complete breakdown in trust between police and the people that they police in areas where a lot of these shootings are happening. So what did LA change? Because now their homicide rate is much lower and their policing reputation is much better. Two things stand out. One is they formed an independent police commission that is highly independent from the mayor. They choose who the police superintendent is. If you recall, in Chicago, Eddie Johnson first became superintendent because Rahm Emanuel suspended the rules of city council for one day. City council suspended their own rules for a day to allow Rahm to appoint his guy. So they control the police. This commission does. The second thing is that if you looked at, Ed read the entire consent decree, so he should probably answer this more, he's better suited to answer this than me. But if you look at it, there's an interesting caveat, which is that the collective bargaining agreement supersedes it. So the federal government even could come in and make recommendations about how Chicago policing needs to improve, but the collective bargaining agreement between the Fraternal Order of Police and the mayor prevents a lot of that. In California, the way they solved this was they put in a peace officer's Bill of Rights in the state, at the state level, to take disciplinary procedures, especially, out of collective bargaining agreements. And the reason that's really important is because in places like Chicago, the mayor has only so much political capital to distribute, and you can get the FOP president and the mayor in the room, and the FOP president will say, yeah, okay, we'll only take 3% annual raises instead of 5% annual raises, but we need 24 hours of alone time before any police officer is allowed to be interviewed about a police-involved shooting. You can't have those types of deals being done in city government. You're not going to get good policing outcomes. So those were the two things I think California did that were really impressive. And Ed can take sort of the reform question.
Ken Griffin? I don't know. Never met the guy. But we have talked to a lot of civic leaders in Chicago, business leaders and other civic leaders. And we bring up a simple concept like a voter-approved charter. And they look at me and they say, what are you talking about? So it is the core thesis of our book that it is an ingrained cultural hubris in Chicago that nobody ever looks outside Chicago for ideas of what to do. When I interviewed city councilmen from elsewhere, I said, do you ever network with Chicago councilmen? They said, yeah. Whenever we're faced with a problem, we call Chicago, find out what they do, and then we know what not to do. So I can't answer it specifically for him, but I would say that most people in Chicago are profoundly ignorant of what other cities do.
I was really struck by the last slide. I have this insight that, because I have friends from around the country who come and visit, and they'll tell you, no one talks about their government, Illinois, Cook County, or Chicago, like people from here. Everybody else in the country has much more normal type government. And there's a morale issue. People here either don't know or it's just pointless. Why would you do it? Why would you hassle these guys? Why would you risk that? They can ruin you. How do you overcome that, this Stockholm syndrome that we have?
So one of the more important things, and the reason I liked working on this book, is that we lay out the man-made problems that Chicago faces, which most people are aware of. They might not be aware of like the severity of them, but they're aware that there's big problems here. Where they have a problem is that there's a simple political theory in Chicago that's very pervasive, and it's 3 steps. Step one is everybody's corrupt. Step 2 is there's nothing we can do about it. And step 3 is it's hopeless. So the reason we wrote this book is because there's a gap between, people know something's wrong, but nobody was talking about aldermanic privilege until Ed Berg, the Fed showed up at Ed Berg's office, and how, maybe aldermen shouldn't control this minutia, right? In case of a crisis, or in case even like a crisis of faith in government in the case of Ed Berg, there needs to be a blueprint lying around that has structural solutions that aren't based on replacing the chair of the finance committee. That's not a solution to any of these problems, or replacing the leadership in the 14th Ward. That's why we focused on the structural aspect. Anything to add to that?
Yeah. When I talked about this chart, I used a lot of 75-cent words, but the fact of the matter is, if you're in the lower right-hand corner, you don't know and you don't care. If you buy our book, you'll know and you'll care.
Can you expand a little bit on the connection between the governance structure and the pension crisis and how like one affects the other?
Well, first of all, the pension crisis that we have is part of the profound fiscal disconnect. And the paradox of Chicago, as we see, is what we pay for governance right now, starting with police and fire, is more than we should, and yet, because we're not paying for our pensions, we're getting free government. We've been taking a ride for $43 billion. So that is pension debt. It is the thesis of our pension chapter that we need to pay for today so our children will be free to pay for tomorrow. And to catch up the pension debt that we have here, we show that based upon the reports of just the top 5 pension plans, it will take them 40 years to catch the funding up to 90%, and that will require $170 billion worth of payments. And that's a legacy cost. That's paying for something that the people paying it are going to get no benefit. The benefit we've already received. So how did it come about? I could talk all day. It doesn't matter. We've got the problem. How do we balance the interests between the people that have to pay for it and the people that are expecting to receive those benefits? So I don't know whether that answers it, but it does go back to those fiscal control measures. If you had approval over the pensions, voter approval over the pensions, you had robust, intelligent people in city council, you had an elected chief financial officer that was looking, when they made all these decisions, you wouldn't have those situations. Did we answer your question?
So certainly the lack of a charter gives a lack of structure, but if so many people are so complacent, as you know that last slide showed, what makes you think that the charter would be a good thing rather than a bad thing, considering that it's Illinois' constitution that has led to the pensions crisis to where we are right now?
So I'm going to give you just a brief summary, but I would highly recommend that you read the report of the 1989 Charter Commission in New York City. So what's the difference between having a charter and not having a charter? First of all, if you go through a charter creation or revision process, it's in the news, and people realize on the street, hey, I can have a say-so in how we change something. We could have an elected school board. We could have a civilian managed police commission. We could have an elected chief financial officer. And then once it's voted on and you have that charter, then the city can't violate it. If they do, any citizen has standing to sue the city to enforce what is in the charter. And if you look at the budget procedures for New York City in their 1989 charter, previous charters, subsequent charters, they spell out how they have to budget and how they have to control their finances. And so you can't change things by ordinance. Did I answer your question?
Not disputing the value of potentially good structure.
Yes.
Right? So that would be an example of there's good structure and there's things that keep the corruption away. If you go back to what Austin was saying, where people think, everybody's corrupt, I can't do anything about it, so why should I care? And in that environment, you put a city charter in, how does it not lock in the current status quo?
Well, it would, of course, would depend upon what the Charter Commission comes up with in their recommendations and what the voters approve or disapprove. But if you take, let's take, I'm going to give you just for simplicity's sake, 6 different reforms at the city council level. And you put those in a proposed charter and they're voted on and approved, it will profoundly change government. Number one, do away with the aldermanic system. Number two, robust city councils that are independently funded. Number three, elected city chief financial officer. Number four, elected city attorney. Take the law department out from underneath the mayor. Outlaw filling vacancies by the mayor and fill them by special election. And six, put in term limits for the city councilman. Those things, if they're voter approved and they can't violate them in any other way, that will profoundly change city government.
Hi. So I understand. I understand why you want to change the role of aldermen so that they're more like legislators. I don't understand why that means we need fewer of them.
So the problem with having 50, so really what we're talking about here is parochial interests. These people, the aldermen right now have no interest in any citywide legislation because they control all the stuff that 55,000 people use every day in their ward. I spoke about earlier, Los Angeles, 250,000 constituents. Aldermen cannot get intimately involved with the minutia of their ward. Those people have their interests, have their street cleaning done by the city, they have their garbage laid out by the city, zoning is done by a zoning commission, or a city council committee that has sort of that citywide lens over things. So if you reduce the number of aldermen, they're less susceptible to capture by a small number of people needing a small number of things. So yeah, there's a great report actually, Mick Dumke at ProPublica put out this report on the nature of ordinances. Over the last 5 years, I think the mayor of Chicago has introduced twice as many ordinances as all aldermen combined. That's not a legislative body. So if you can reduce those number of people that are responsible to a larger number of constituents, we think that will help. Anything else? Yeah.
I'd like to make a broader comment. Your question, very good question, and other questions that we've heard here have an implicit message, and that is, if you make this change, how can you assure that it's going to make a difference? And we've heard that from a lot of audiences. And it is a form of, and I'm not being personally critical of you, but it is a way for people to defend the status quo here, just psychologically, and say, well, what's really so wrong with what we're doing? My recommendation is, if you've really got a question about the number of aldermen, call somebody in LA that's in city government or that's knowledgeable about city government and ask them. There was and we quoted in the book, when they did their 1999 charter revision, there was a proposal to increase the number of councilmen from 15 to 20. And the Charter Commission, and one of the critics of increasing it said, one of the arguments is, well, Chicago's got 50, why can't we at least have 20? And the critics said, to talk about Chicago-style politics and Los Angeles government in the same sentence is ludicrous. So they are as deeply anchored in having 15, and the proposition failed. The voters did not want more than 15 city councilmen. So I'd say look around.
Austin, to follow up on the comment that you made, is the general idea then that a aldermanic system where the aldermen are representing not thousands of people, but tens to hundreds of thousands of people, a system where, take Ed Berg, for example, isn't even aware of the changes that a Burger King wants to make in his ward, let alone having the ability to try to squeeze them for business?
Let alone 2 Burger Kings.
Right. Any other questions?
So given the political rallies in Chicago, what's the first reform, just one reform that might be possible? Okay, none of it's possible. That could be possible in the city of Chicago. Just one, not the whole package.
the catch-all, the umbrella is the city charter. If everybody starts agitating for a voter-approved city constitution, a charter in Chicago, everything else gets lumped into it. All these reforms would be done by charter. So that's the Trojan horse of change in the city of Chicago.
That was my one.
Back to the alderman thing. My whole life growing up here, you heard that if there's a problem in your neighborhood, you call your alderman and the alderman fixes it. And I understand what you're proposing and I see the benefits of the city, but if I have my 5-minute elevator speech to the people in my ward who just want to make sure their sidewalks are shoveled, how do we sell this to them?
Do you have any friends in New York?
I might, but maybe not my constituents in the ward.
Okay. Do you know how they handle it in New York?
I know about the garbage in New York.
Yeah. And incidentally, one reason they have the garbage problem, especially in Manhattan, is they don't have any alleys. Mhm. Yeah. But last week when we were having our municipal elections here, they actually had a special election in New York for the city ombudsman. So all of constituent services are run by a completely different department. It's not run by the city council. And the city ombudsman is the second most powerful person in government. The last 2 mayors were ombudsmen before they were elected to be the mayor. So they have a whole different way of providing constituent services in New York, not through an alderman. The same is true in most other major cities. But they don't always have an elected ombudsman, but they do provide those constituent services more efficiently in other ways.
As someone who works in marketing, I would go with you're going to get better services. You're not going to be reliant on a political hack to provide what you deserve from your city government. Other cities provide the same for less money, and you could have that too if you stripped this guy of the power to deliver those types of things.
You talked a little bit about the independent financial controls, particularly an independently elected comptroller and a robust involvement from a city council. Do you have any insights on how those interact with like tax increment financing or other economic development incentives in other cities?
We didn't look at development incentives. TIF is like a whole other, we devote maybe a couple paragraphs to TIF in the book, and essentially saying this is just another massive avenue by which the mayor is able to exercise complete dominance over citywide policy. He has a huge hundreds of millions of dollars slush fund that is controlled by him alone, that he then doles out to different wards and then buys city council loyalty through that. Ed, do you have any thoughts on?
Sure. Yeah, plenty of thoughts. First of all, if you go to the major cities that we interviewed people and ask them about their TIF program, it would be as foreign to them as a charter is to us. TIFs are not widespread and they're not widely abused as we see this. But once again, I would encourage you, if you're curious or a nerd at all, read the charter revision for New York in 1989. They have a whole section there where they spelled out how the city will go about concessions. And the greatest concession that we had in the city of Chicago was the 75-year parking meter deal. They spell out concessions, they spell out franchises, they spell out zoning, land use. All these things are spelled out specifically how they're administered by the city and not by the political process. So once again, you can lump so many different things in a charter, and that would be my answer to your question.
The average person is not a political nerd and probably doesn't think about politics in their daily life. And without lecturing someone, what is a 1-sentence, a 2-sentence thing you could say to your average person to make them think, maybe I shouldn't keep voting for the status quo, and maybe I should consider voting in the other direction?
who catches it. Yeah, this is kind of a messaging question, right? Like, kind of similar to the aldermanic question that you had. Do you hate Chicago government? There are man-made reasons for that, and there are man-made solutions that we can pursue, the biggest being a constitution for the city.
So my answer to the question is, and I'm going to go back and there was a famous mutual fund manager by the name of Peter Lynch who worked for Fidelity Mutual Funds. And he said if the average person would put as much time and effort into picking a stock as they did in choosing a refrigerator, they'd all be millionaires. So one of the problems that people have in the city of Chicago is they don't really understand how government works. They have no access to it. They're not stupid people. I'm a complete sports illiterate. But when I talk to people about sports and they tell me all the things they know and how they evaluate sports, they understand something that is a very complex phenomena that I don't understand. They can understand how city government works and they can get involved. They can know and they can care, but nobody's presented it to them in a way that's accessible. So once again, I would encourage you to part with $20 tonight, buy the book, and once you know, you'll care.
Incidentally, the best description of the city council in Chicago and its problems was made by Chance the Rapper like 4 months ago. He did it for Thrillist. Hannibal Buress, the comedian, is in it. It's fantastic. It's the best explanation of the governance problem of city council that I've ever seen, and lots of people saw it.
Do you guys know the history of why so many cities had the foresight to have a charter and Chicago didn't? Was it just corruption or was it something else?
A great deal of it has to do with the state constitution and how terrible our state constitution of 1970 is, but I'll let Ed elaborate on that.
Yeah. So that is the case. Most cities had a strong man mayor at the turn of the previous century. So going from the 1800s to the 1900s, just about every major city had a strong man mayor. But you had a progressive movement back in the 19aughts, 1910s. And so reform movements started to develop in all these cities. It never developed in Chicago. Ironically, the Constitution that we had in Illinois from 1870 to 1970 for 100 years, in the local government provision, it allowed for a city charter. In 1970, the Constitutional Convention, in their infinite wisdom, did away with that, so you can't have a charter. We're one of 5 states that doesn't allow a charter. So, whereas other states over the past 120 years have been progressing, Illinois has been regressing.
All right, a round of applause for Austin and Ed. I want to tell you about the next 2 events that we have coming up. The next one is going to be on Saturday, March 30th, and it is going to be right back here at this Elephant and Castle location. It will be with my friend Richard Lawrence, who is the Executive Vice President of the Foundation for Economic Education. And he's going to be talking about the research that FEE has done into how do we talk to people unlike us. So part to the question of how do we talk to people about some of these ideas, part of it is that we're talking about something we believe in that they're not persuaded of already. So if you want more on that, come here, Richard. That'll start. The doors will open at 7, and we'll get started probably around 7:30, so a little later than we normally do. We're going to be welcoming some people from the Philadelphia Society Convention, which is going to be just a couple blocks away. So really excited about that. And then the other that we really just got confirmed today that I'm very excited about is going to be on Wednesday, April 24th. It's going to be at the Showplace Icon movie theater at Roosevelt Collection on Roosevelt, just west of Clark. Roosevelt and Delano. It's like a 4-block street in the South Loop. It like breaks up at 3 different locations. I used to live not far from there. Correct, Roosevelt and Delano. So it's on the other side of the really big Target on Roosevelt, if you know what I'm talking about. But we're going to be hosting a screening of the new film, The Pursuit. which is from Arthur Brooks, who is the outgoing president of the American Enterprise Institute. If you're not familiar with Arthur Brooks, come talk to me because I can tell you all about him because he's one of my really favorite people in this world. He just had a really great piece in the New York Times a couple days ago about our current culture of contempt and the way that we're not just disagreeing with people, we're actually despising people we disagree with, and what he thinks we can do about that. This film is kind of about the years ago, we hosted Deirdre McCloskey, the economist, who talked about how economic development, basically people living on $1 a day is just static for almost all of humanity. And then at one point in the 1700s, it explodes. And what Arthur explores is kind of how did that happen? Why did that happen? The kind of entrepreneurial spirit that drives a lot of that. Arthur is truly phenomenal. So I really hope you'll come see this film. Again, it's Wednesday, April 24th at the Showplace Icon Theater at Roosevelt Collection. So mark those down. If you want to know more about America's Future Foundation, you can go to americasfuture.org, or you can come talk to me. You can talk to Jeff, who's raising his hand in the back there, or Kara, who's raising her hand in the back there. We're the board members for this chapter. Please come talk to us. Thank you again for coming, and have a good evening.